Emily Carter thought she'd hit the jackpot when she landed a position at the prestigious Prescott Group. But that dream quickly twisted into something darker the moment she met him. Alexander Prescott isn't just the CEO, he's a force of nature. Wealth drips from his tailored suits, and power practically hums in the air around him. But behind his dazzling exterior is a boss with a reputation, ruthless, demanding, and downright nasty. He doesn't just expect perfection, he demands it, no matter the cost. From their very first meeting, Alexander makes it clear that working for him will be a trial by fire. His biting sarcasm, relentless standards, and penetrating stares unravel Emily's carefully constructed defenses. She's determined to prove herself, but she never expected her boss to push her limits in more ways than one. What starts as a battle of wills turns into a dangerous game of seduction. When late nights in the office lead to fiery moments behind locked doors, Emily discovers there's more to her boss than his icy persona. Alexander is a man haunted by secrets, and as Emily gets closer to the truth, she realizes those secrets could destroy everything, including her. In this sizzling billionaire office romance, nasty, rich, boss takes readers on a roller coaster of passion, power, and forbidden desire. The question isn't just whether Emily can survive working for Alexander, it's whether she can survive falling for him. Chapter 1, Welcome to His World. The elevator shot upward with a mechanical hum, carrying Emily Carter to the 37th floor of Prescott Group's headquarters. Her pulse thumped in rhythm with the ascent, each passing floor tightening the knot in her stomach. This was it. The big leagues. The sleek elevator doors opened to reveal a sprawling office suite dripping with modern luxury. White marble floors, glossy black walls, and abstract art pieces that screamed money. The air even smelled expensive, like leather and fresh-cut lilies. "Ms. Carter," a clipped voice called out. Emily turned to face a severe-looking woman in a tailored black suit. Her hair was pulled into a no-nonsense bun, and her piercing gaze felt like it could strip paint. "I'm Grace. Follow me," she said, not waiting for a response before turning on her heel. Emily hurried to keep up, her low heels clicking awkwardly against the polished floor. Grace led her down a corridor lined with glass walls that gave glimpses of busy employees typing furiously or answering calls. Then they arrived at his office. Grace opened the door and motioned for Emily to step inside. The space was massive, dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. But what caught Emily's attention wasn't the view, it was the man standing at the far end of the room, his back to her as he gazed out the window. Alexander Prescott. His presence was almost oppressive, even from across the room. He turned slowly, and Emily's breath hitched. Tall and devastatingly handsome, Alexander exuded raw power. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his sharp jaw clean-shaven, and his piercing blue eyes seemed to pin her in place. The tailored charcoal suit he wore only emphasized his commanding presence. "You're late," he said, his deep voice cutting through the silence. Emily glanced at her watch, confused. I don't think I am, Mr. Prescott. It's 8:55. Exactly. If you're not 5 minutes early, you're late, he replied, arching a brow. Her cheeks flushed, but she refused to let him intimidate her. "I'll remember that for tomorrow." He didn't smile. Instead, he gestured to a chair in front of his desk. "Sit. We need to talk about expectations." Emily sat, clutching her bag tightly in her lap. "Working for me isn't easy," Alexander began, his tone sharp and unapologetic. "I expect nothing less than perfection. Your job is to anticipate my needs before I even know I have them. Can you do that, Ms. Carter?" "Yes, Mr. Prescott," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing in her chest. "Good. Then prove it." The next hour was a whirlwind. Alexander rattled off tasks and deadlines at lightning speed, his eyes sharp and unforgiving. Emily scribbled notes furiously, determined not to miss a single detail. "Is that clear?" he asked finally, his gaze locking onto hers. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice firm. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, approval maybe? Then it was gone, replaced by his usual steely demeanor. "Then get to work," he said, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. As Emily left his office, she couldn't help but exhale sharply. The man was as infuriating as he was captivating. But this was just day one. The following morning, Emily arrived 10 minutes early, determined not to repeat her late faux pas. She sat at her desk, a sleek glass workspace just outside Alexander Prescott's office. The air was crisp, the hum of productivity filling the vast executive floor. Before she could settle in, her phone buzzed sharply, a direct line to Alexander. "Get in here," his clipped voice commanded. Emily straightened her blazer and walked into his office. Alexander was already at his desk, his focus fixed on his laptop screen. His tie was loose, and his sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms. The sight was distracting. "Ms. Carter," he said without looking up, "I've sent you an email with today's agenda. I expect those tasks completed before the day's end. And cancel my lunch with the investor." Emily paused, her mind racing. Cancel lunch? She barely knew his schedule yet, let alone how to navigate his high-profile meetings. "Is there a problem?" Alexander asked, his tone icy as he finally looked up. "No, sir," she replied quickly. "Consider it done." "Good. Then why are you still standing here?" She turned to leave, biting her tongue. His tone, his demands, the way he wielded his power, it was all maddening. And yet, there was something about him that made it impossible to look away. The day spiraled into chaos. Emily spent hours juggling Alexander's demands. By noon, she'd reorganized his calendar, fielded half a dozen calls, and managed to reschedule his investor meeting without a hitch. Just as she thought she could catch her breath, Grace appeared. "Mr. Prescott needs you in the conference room. Now." The urgency in Grace's voice left no room for questions. Emily grabbed her notebook and followed, her heart pounding. The conference room was a battlefield of power suits and tense faces. Alexander stood at the head of the table, commanding attention with his presence alone. "Ms. Carter," he said as she entered, his tone smooth but firm. "Come here." Emily approached, feeling the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on her. Alexander handed her a stack of documents. "Distribute these. Then take notes. Every word." She nodded and moved quickly, passing the files around the table before taking a seat in the corner. As the meeting began, Alexander's sharp intellect was on full display. He dismantled objections, proposed solutions, and directed the room with the precision of a master strategist. But it wasn't just his brilliance that held Emily's attention, it was the way he wielded his authority. His voice was measured, his tone relentless. There was no room for weakness, no tolerance for failure. It was intoxicating. Hours later, Emily was back at her desk, typing up the meeting notes. Her fingers ached, her brain was fried, and yet she felt a strange sense of accomplishment. "Ms. Carter," Alexander's voice interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see him leaning against the doorway of his office. "Come in," he said, disappearing inside. Emily followed, unsure of what to expect. "I need this report proofread and sent to the board before the end of the day," he said, handing her a thick stack of papers. His expression softened, just a fraction. "You've done well today." The unexpected praise threw her off balance. "Thank you, Mr. Prescott." "Don't thank me yet," he said, his smirk returning. "You're still on probation." As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Emily." She turned back, startled by the use of her first name. "Most people don't last a week in this position. But you might surprise me." Her heart raced as his words hung in the air. There was something in his gaze, something deeper, something unspoken. That night, as Emily walked out of the building under the glow of city lights, she couldn't shake the day's events. Alexander Prescott was ruthless, infuriating, and impossible to please. But he was also magnetic, his every move pulling her deeper into his orbit. She wasn't sure if she was up for the challenge, or if she even wanted to resist. The following morning, Emily arrived at Prescott Group armed with coffee, determination, and a growing awareness that working for Alexander Prescott wasn't just a job, it was a trial by fire. The buzz of the executive floor was sharper than usual, and the air hummed with tension. "Ms. Carter." Grace's sharp voice cut through the air as Emily set her bag down. "Mr. Prescott wants you in the conference room. Immediately." Emily grabbed her notebook, her stomach twisting. Another meeting? She hadn't even had a chance to review his calendar for the day. The conference room was a hive of activity. The usual polished executives were seated around the table, but the atmosphere was strained. Alexander stood at the head of the room, his arms crossed, a storm brewing in his eyes. "Ms. Carter," he said as soon as she entered, his tone clipped. "Close the door." Emily complied, her pulse quickening. Alexander didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Our competitors at Haverton Corporation have released a product strikingly similar to our flagship design," he said, his voice like steel. I need to know how this happened, and who's responsible. A murmur rippled through the room. Emily could feel the tension in every glance exchanged around the table. Alexander's gaze landed on her. Ms. Carter, you'll assist me directly in this matter. We'll need discretion and precision. Can I trust you with this? Yes, sir, Emily said, her voice steady despite the weight of his stare. Good. Everyone else, dismissed. The room emptied quickly, leaving Emily alone with Alexander. He leaned against the edge of the table, his eyes narrowing as he considered her. This situation demands immediate attention. I need someone I can rely on, someone who doesn't crumble under pressure. Do you understand what I'm asking of you? I do, she replied, meeting his gaze. For a moment, he studied her, as if assessing whether she was truly capable. Then he handed her a USB drive. This contains everything we've gathered so far. I need you to cross-reference it with internal communications from the last 6 months. Look for anything unusual, discrepancies, unauthorized access, anything that doesn't belong. Emily's breath hitched. The task was monumental, but she nodded. I'll get it done. Hours passed in a blur of data. Emily pored over emails, memos, and reports, her focus unyielding. The deeper she dug, the more troubling patterns she uncovered: anomalies in system access logs, encrypted messages that didn't follow protocol, and a handful of meetings that hadn't been officially documented. Ms. Carter. Alexander's voice startled her. She looked up to see him standing by her desk, his tie loosened and his expression serious. What have you found? He asked, his tone softer than usual. Emily handed him a printout of her findings. There's something unusual here, several unauthorized access points from within the company. I can't say for sure yet, but it looks deliberate. Alexander's jaw tightened as he scanned the documents. This is unacceptable. There's more, Emily said, hesitating. One of the access points is tied to a device registered to someone on the executive team. His eyes snapped to hers, sharp and full of fury. Who? She swallowed. William Hartman. He's the VP of development, right? Alexander's expression darkened. He is. And he's about to have a very unpleasant conversation. Later that evening, Emily found herself in Alexander's office, assisting him with compiling evidence for an internal investigation. The atmosphere was electric, the tension between them almost palpable. You've done impressive work today, Ms. Carter, Alexander said, breaking the silence. Thank you, she replied, her voice soft. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. I didn't think you'd last this long. Most don't. I'm not most people, she said before she could stop herself. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. No, you're not. For a moment, the room felt smaller, the air charged. Emily's pulse quickened under the weight of his stare. Why did you take this job? He asked suddenly, his tone curious. She hesitated. Because I needed a challenge. I wanted to prove I could handle more than just a paycheck. You've proven that, he said, his voice low. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Emily didn't dare move, afraid the moment might shatter. But then he straightened, the spell broken. That'll be all for tonight. Go home and get some rest. Tomorrow will be complicated. As Emily left the building, the city lights blurred around her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she'd crossed a line, one she wasn't sure she could return from. Working for Alexander Prescott was more than she'd bargained for. And yet, she couldn't deny the pull he had on her, the way he made her want to push herself harder, reach further. But the more she got to know him, the more she realized Alexander wasn't just a boss. He was a mystery. And Emily was determined to unravel him, no matter the cost. Emily arrived at the office the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose. The file she'd uncovered last night painted a grim picture of internal betrayal, and the thought of Alexander Prescott relying on her to expose the truth was as thrilling as it was daunting. But as she reached her desk, an uneasy feeling settled in. A manila envelope sat on her chair, unmarked and unaddressed. Her first instinct was to toss it aside. It could have been someone's misplaced paperwork, but curiosity won out. She opened it carefully, her heart pounding as she pulled out its contents. Inside were photographs. Of her. One showed her entering Alexander's office late the previous evening, another captured her at her desk reviewing confidential documents, and a third showed her stepping out of the building. Beneath them was a single piece of paper. Keep your nose out of things that don't concern you. Emily's stomach churned. Someone knew she was digging, and they weren't happy about it. By the time Alexander called her into his office, Emily's nerves were frayed. She clutched the envelope in her hand as she stepped inside, her mind racing. Should she tell him? Or would it only make things worse? Alexander was seated behind his desk, his sharp blue eyes focused on her the moment she entered. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, his voice low and serious. Emily hesitated, then placed the envelope on his desk. "This was on my chair this morning." He opened it and scanned the photos, his expression darkening with each passing second. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. He rose abruptly, pacing the room like a caged predator. "This confirms it. Someone inside this company is watching us, closely." Emily felt a cold chill run down her spine. "What do we do?" "We don't stop," Alexander said, his tone sharp. "If anything, we double down. Whoever's behind this wants us scared." "I don't scare easily." His words were resolute, but the tension in his jaw betrayed his anger. Emily couldn't help but admire the way he handled pressure, even in the face of a direct threat. "I need you to keep working on those files," he continued, his voice softer. "But be careful. Don't talk to anyone about this. Not Grace, not security. No one." "Understood," Emily said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. For a moment, Alexander's gaze softened. "And Emily, if anything else happens, you come to me immediately. No exceptions." Her heart skipped a beat at the unexpected concern in his tone. "I will." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Emily buried herself in her work, combing through more files and uncovering a few additional anomalies that added to the growing web of deceit. By mid-afternoon, she was feeling the strain. Her head throbbed, her eyes ached, and she couldn't shake the paranoia that someone was watching her. Then it happened. As she was heading back to her desk after grabbing coffee, she tripped. At first, she thought it was her own clumsiness, until she saw the polished shoe deliberately placed in her path. "Careful there," a voice drawled. She looked up to see William Hartman, the VP of Development, smirking down at her. His expression was too smug, his tone too casual. "Mr. Hartman," she said, forcing her voice to remain calm. "I didn't see you there." "I'm sure you didn't," he replied, his smile never reaching his eyes. "You've been awfully busy lately, haven't you? Late nights, secret meetings with Alexander." Emily froze. The way he said Alexander's name felt deliberate, like he was testing her reaction. "Just doing my job," she said, straightening up. "Of course," he said, his smirk widening. "But remember, Emily, this company thrives on loyalty. Stray too far, and you might find yourself in uncomfortable territory." With that he walked away, leaving her shaken but more determined than ever. That evening, Emily stayed late once again, determined to find something, anything, that would tie Hartman to the unauthorized access logs. As she sifted through the files, the office was eerily quiet. The usual hum of activity had died down, leaving only the occasional creak of the building and the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then she heard it. A faint sound, like a door opening and closing. Her heart raced as she glanced toward Alexander's office. The door was ajar, a soft light spilling into the hallway. Taking a deep breath, she approached cautiously. "Alexander," she called softly. No response. She stepped inside and froze. The room had been ransacked. Papers were strewn across the desk, drawers left open, and a monitor lay cracked on the floor. Before she could react, a hand clamped over her mouth, and she was pulled back into the shadows. Emily's heart raced as she struggled against the hand covering her mouth. The office lights seemed to blur in her peripheral vision, but her instincts kicked in. She stomped down hard on her attacker's foot, and the grip loosened just enough for her to break free. She spun around, her fists clenched, ready to scream, until she saw Alexander standing there, his tie loosened and his shirt sleeves rolled up, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Quiet," he said sharply, holding a finger to his lips. "Are you kidding me?" she whispered furiously, her voice trembling with equal parts fear and anger. "You scared the hell out of me." "I had to make sure it was you," he replied, his tone low and serious. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the chaos. "Someone's been here. They were looking for something." Emily's panic began to subside, replaced by a surge of determination. "They didn't take everything. Maybe we can figure out what they were after." Alexander nodded, stepping past her to examine his desk. "Help me sort this out." We don't have much time before security starts making rounds. They worked in silence, methodically organizing the mess. Emily's mind raced as she sifted through the papers, trying to make sense of the intrusion. This wasn't random, Alexander said after a moment, his voice tight. He held up a torn folder, its contents scattered. They wanted something specific. Emily knelt beside him, her eyes narrowing as she spotted a document partially hidden under the desk. She reached for it and froze when she saw the header, Project Nexus, Confidential. "What's this?" she asked, holding it up. Alexander's jaw tightened. "It's something that should have been locked in my private safe." Emily's pulse quickened. Whoever's behind this knows exactly what they're doing. They're inside the company. Alexander's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of vulnerability behind his usual steel demeanor. "Which means we can't trust anyone. Not even security." As they continued piecing together the mess, Emily couldn't help but notice the way Alexander moved, deliberate, controlled, yet brimming with an undercurrent of restrained fury. "You're taking this awfully well," she said, unable to stop herself. He glanced at her, one brow raised. "I'm not in the habit of falling apart when things go wrong." "Right," she said, her tone dry. "You're too busy being perfect." To her surprise, his lips quirked in the faintest hint of a smirk. "Someone has to be." Despite the gravity of the situation, she felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. Alexander Prescott was an enigma, a man who wielded power like a weapon yet carried an air of solitude that made her wonder if anyone truly knew him. "Do you ever let anyone in?" she asked before she could stop herself. His smirk faded, replaced by a guarded expression. "Not when the stakes are this high." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words hanging between them. By the time they finished organizing the wreckage, it was well past midnight. Alexander sat back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the document Emily had found. "We'll need to lock this up somewhere safer," he said. "And I'll need you to keep digging into Hartman. He's our strongest lead." Emily nodded, though the exhaustion was beginning to catch up with her. "What about the photographs? And the note?" Alexander's expression darkened. "I'll handle that. For now, focus on the files. And be careful, whoever's behind this knows we're onto them." As she stood to leave, Alexander stopped her. "Emily." She turned, surprised by the softness in his tone. "You've been handling all of this better than most people would." "I don't say this often, but I'm impressed." Heat rose to her cheeks. "Thank you, Mr. Prescott." He gave her a faint smile, one that felt oddly genuine. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we fight back." The next morning, Emily was greeted by a battlefield. The office was abuzz with gossip about the break-in, though no one seemed to know the full story. Hartman was more smug than usual, his presence a constant reminder of the tension simmering beneath the surface. "You look tired, Carter," he remarked as he passed her desk. "Long night." Emily forced a tight smile. "Busy, as always." His chuckle sent a shiver down her spine, but she refused to let him see her falter. By midday, the tension between Emily and Alexander reached a boiling point. In the middle of a heated discussion about their next steps, she snapped. "You can't just bulldoze through every problem like you own the world," she said, slamming her notebook on his desk. Alexander's eyes narrowed. "That's exactly what I do. It's how I've kept this company at the top." "Well, maybe if you trusted people instead of controlling everything, you wouldn't be cleaning up someone else's mess right now." The silence that followed was deafening. Emily's chest heaved as she braced for his response, expecting him to lash out. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, a slow smirk spreading across his face. "You're not afraid to challenge me," he said, almost amused. "Most people wouldn't dare." "Maybe you need someone to challenge you," she shot back. For a moment, their gazes locked, the air between them crackling with unspoken tension. "Maybe I do," he said softly. The days that followed felt like a pressure cooker, with the walls of Prescott Group seeming to close in on Emily and Alexander. Every conversation was laced with unspoken tension, every glance a battle of wills. The investigation into the leak intensified, pulling them deeper into a web of corporate deceit, where every shadow felt like a threat. But it wasn't just the investigation consuming Emily's thoughts. It was him. Alexander Prescott wasn't just a boss, he was a force of nature. His biting remarks, razor-sharp focus, and the rare glimpses of vulnerability beneath his steely exterior had Emily drawn to him in ways she couldn't control. And it terrified her. One evening, Alexander summoned her to his office, as he often did these days. The city lights glowed outside the massive windows, casting the room in a warm golden hue. Emily stepped inside, notebook in hand, ready to jot down whatever impossible task he was about to throw her way. But tonight, Alexander wasn't seated behind his desk. He stood by the window, a glass of whiskey in hand, his silhouette striking against the glittering skyline. "Close the door," he said, his voice softer than usual. Emily obeyed, her pulse quickening. "Have a seat," he said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs across from his desk. She hesitated but eventually sat down, her notebook forgotten in her lap. Alexander turned to face her, his gaze unreadable. "We're running out of time," he said finally. "Hartman's getting bolder. The board is asking questions. And now, I have a new problem." "What problem?" she asked, leaning forward. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You." Emily blinked, caught off guard. "Me?" "You're a distraction, Emily," he said, his tone blunt but not unkind. "And I can't afford distractions." Her cheeks flushed. "I'm just doing my job." "No," he said, stepping closer. "You're doing far more than that. You're questioning me, challenging me. And it's making me," he paused, his jaw tightening as if he hated admitting it. "It's making me care." Emily's breath hitched. "I don't understand." He leaned against his desk, towering over her, his eyes locked onto hers. "I built this company on discipline and control. I don't let emotions get in the way. But you," he trailed off, his gaze flickering to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. "You make it impossible to ignore." The air between them was electric, charged with a tension that had been simmering for weeks. "Alexander," she began, her voice trembling, "this isn't." He cut her off, his voice low and rough. "Tell me to stop, Emily. If this isn't what you want, say the word, and I'll walk away." Her heart thundered in her chest as she met his gaze. Every rational part of her screamed to end this now, to keep their relationship strictly professional. But when she opened her mouth, the word wouldn't come. Instead she whispered, "I don't want you to stop." In an instant, he was in front of her, his hand tilting her chin up to meet his lips. The kiss was fierce, demanding, and filled with weeks of pent-up frustration. Emily melted into him, her fingers clutching the front of his shirt as his hands slid into her hair. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. There was no investigation, no betrayal, no corporate espionage, only them. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, their foreheads resting against each other. "This changes everything," Alexander said softly. Emily nodded, her mind spinning. "I know. We'll have to be careful," he continued, his voice filled with determination. "This company is a shark tank. If anyone finds out—" "They won't," she said firmly, though she wasn't entirely sure how they'd keep it under wraps. Alexander stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "We should focus on the investigation. Hartman's playing a dangerous game, and I won't let him win." Emily straightened, her resolve strengthening. "Neither will I." He smiled at her, a rare, genuine smile that made her heart skip a beat. "Good. Because if I'm going to have you at my side, Emily Carter, I need to know you're as ruthless as I am." The next day, the dynamic between them shifted. In public, they maintained their usual professional distance, Alexander barking orders, Emily countering him with her usual tenacity. But behind closed doors, the lines had blurred irrevocably. Late that afternoon, Emily uncovered something critical, a series of encrypted emails linking Hartman to a third-party consulting firm with a dubious reputation. She burst into Alexander's office, the evidence clutched in her hand. "I found something," she said, shutting the door behind her. Alexander took the papers, his eyes scanning the documents quickly. "This is it," he said, his voice low and triumphant. "This is the proof we need to take him down." "What's the next step?" Emily asked, her adrenaline pumping. "We confront him," Alexander said, his gaze hard. "But not yet. We need to ensure this evidence is airtight before we make a move." Emily nodded, but the fire in her eyes matched his. "Let's do it. Whatever it takes."